This case shocked an entire town, and then the country. What started with the foul smell behind a forgotten house on Larkspur Lane turned into one of the most disturbing discoveries in modern true crime history. What police found inside that basement would uncover a decade-long nightmare no one could have imagined. Meet Officer Daniel Reese, the first man to step inside the darkness. Forensic analyst Melissa Vann, who decoded the tapes, and Agent Thomas Greer, the lead investigator who would become part of the story himself. This is the case of The Collector, a name whispered across evidence rooms and never spoken aloud in courtrooms. Because no one has ever caught him. If you're into deep, twisted cases like this, make sure to support the channel by clicking that like button, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We bring you the most chilling true crime stories you've never heard before. Real cases, real people, and real terror. Stay active in the comments, share your theories, and let's uncover the truth together. Larkspur Lane was one of those streets where nothing ever seemed to happen. Tucked away in a small Colorado town, the neighborhood was quiet, predictable, and untouched by anything more serious than the occasional noise complaint. But at the very end of that lane stood a house that everyone quietly avoided. It wasn't abandoned exactly, but it gave off the feeling of something forgotten. The grass grew knee-high. The windows were always shut. The mailbox was overflowing with years-old junk mail. Some kids in the area called it the house that watches, and no one dared knock on its door. It wasn't fear that kept people away. It was something harder to describe, a kind of instinctual unease. That all changed on an early October morning when a city maintenance worker came to inspect a sewage line. He was walking near the property when he caught a heavy, sickening smell coming from the backyard. Assuming it was a dead animal, he peeked over the rotting fence. But what struck him wasn't just the odor, it was the basement windows. They were completely blacked out from the inside, not with curtains or paint, but with something thick and industrial. It didn't make sense. Combined with the smell, it was enough to make a call. Animal control responded first, but quickly turned it over to local police. The officers who arrived weren't expecting anything beyond perhaps animal hoarding or a neglected elderly tenant. Still, protocol was followed. A warrant was obtained. The door was unlocked. The interior of the house was coated in thick layers of dust. Furniture was covered in white sheets. Time felt frozen inside, as if the house had been left mid-moment, and no one ever returned. It was in the kitchen where officers found something strange. A trapdoor beneath a faded rug, secured with 3 different padlocks. Each lock was cut, and the door groaned open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into complete darkness. The first officer to enter would later report that the air shifted the moment he stepped down, becoming colder, thicker, almost electric with tension. As their flashlights swept across the basement floor, what they saw stopped them in their tracks. The room was far from empty. It had been transformed into a space unlike anything they had encountered, part surveillance room, part shrine, part prison. Officers backed out and immediately called for backup, forensics, and federal assistance. They knew they hadn't walked into a forgotten basement. They had just opened the first page of a story that was far from over. The basement was a carefully constructed nightmare. Every inch of it had been meticulously arranged with a purpose no one could immediately understand. Lining the concrete walls were shelves crammed with VHS tapes, each marked only with the date, hundreds of them, spanning more than a decade. Dust coated the plastic casings, yet the tapes themselves were perfectly stacked, alphabetized by year. Alongside them were old television monitors and VHS players, many of them still plugged into power outlets. Some screens displayed static, One flickered on for a second when touched, revealing a brief, haunting flash of a person sitting motionless in a chair. In the far corner of the room stood a row of mannequin heads, each one wearing a different wig. Some had makeup applied, others had faint red stains on them. Nearby were sketchbooks filled with hundreds of faces, hand-drawn in charcoal or ink. The expressions were always the same: wide-eyed, afraid, confused. The pages were numbered, and many of the drawings included notes about behavior changes, stage resistance, and detachment levels. The handwriting was careful, precise, almost clinical. It became clear to the investigators that whoever had created this space had been documenting more than just appearances. They were studying people, observing them in isolation, and doing it over and over again. But the real horror waited at the back of the room, behind a door made of reinforced steel. It was secured with multiple deadbolts and bore deep scratch marks around the edges. When the door was finally opened, a second, smaller chamber was revealed, soundproofed, sealed tight, and stripped of anything resembling humanity. The second room contained a metal bed bolted to the floor, chains hanging from the walls, and a camera mounted on a rusted tripod facing the center. The air inside was colder than the rest of the basement, and the smell was sharp, with bleach, mold, and something rotting beneath it all. There were gloves scattered on the floor, used syringes, in a tray, and a filing cabinet full of handwritten logs. Each log described a person by a first name only, along with a timeline that tracked their behavior over weeks until the final entry always ended with the word "removed." Despite everything, no bodies were found, no recent fingerprints, no sign of the person responsible. But there was no doubt that terrible things had taken place here. The scene wasn't chaotic. It was structured, methodical, and that's what frightened investigators most. This wasn't the work of a madman, it was the work of someone who had planned every step and knew exactly what they were doing. The true scale of the horror began to unfold when investigators started reviewing the materials collected from the basement. The VHS tapes were sent to a secure lab and carefully examined one by one. What they discovered left experienced agents shaken. Each tape followed the same disturbing pattern: a single individual, always alone, seated in the center of the soundproof basement room. The camera never moved. There was no speaking, no visible torment, just long, silent recordings of people confined in the room, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. The subjects would sit, pace, cry, sleep, clearly waiting for something or someone that never appeared on screen. Some victims were seen on multiple tapes, tracked over time. The logs matched with the footage, documenting their changes. Hair grew out, weight dropped, faces became hollow. Then, in every case, the footage stopped abruptly. No scenes of escape, no struggle, no release. Just silence, and then nothing. The next tape would feature a new person. Authorities cross-referenced the individuals with missing persons databases. One by one, matches were confirmed. A teacher who vanished walking home from school. A young woman who disappeared after a concert. A boy last seen at a rest stop. None had been seen in years. Then came the discovery that changed the direction of the case. Among the notebooks found in the basement was one that stood out. Its pages were covered with hand-drawn diagrams, blueprints of a room nearly identical to the basement where the tapes had been filmed, but the measurements didn't match. The layout was reversed, the camera positioned differently, and the furniture slightly rearranged. The basement they had discovered appeared to be a reconstruction, a replica made after the fact, which raised a chilling question: where was the original location? Investigators scoured public records and found that the house on Larkspur Lane had changed owners multiple times over the years, but the current owner, listed only as a trust, had purchased the property 3 years prior and never filed a single update. Forensics found no signs of recent life inside the house. No food, no clothing, no trace of someone living there full time. The house was a shell, hiding a monument to something deeply disturbed. But if the crimes hadn't happened there, if the tapes were filmed elsewhere, then the person responsible had moved everything afterward, which meant the basement wasn't just a crime scene. It was a message. Someone had gone to great lengths to recreate what had already been done. It suggested a ritual, pattern, warning, and it meant that the real place, the real horror, might still be active somewhere else. The GPS coordinates scribbled in the blueprint notebook led investigators deep into the Colorado wilderness, nearly 50 miles from the house on Larkspur Lane. The area was remote, largely inaccessible by car, with no cell signal and dense, overgrown trees lining the broken path. After several hours of searching, they found it a decaying farmhouse partially hidden by the woods, its roof sagging, windows broken, and door nearly falling off its hinges. From the outside, it looked abandoned for decades, but investigators had learned by now that appearances meant nothing in this case. Inside the house, nature had already begun reclaiming the space. Mold crept up the walls, and dead leaves scattered across the warped floorboards. But something about the interior felt wrong. The dust had been disturbed. Footprints, fresh ones, led from the front door to a hallway in the back. There, behind a bookshelf on rusted hinges, they found a staircase leading down. Unlike the first house, this basement wasn't hidden beneath a trapdoor it was meant to be used. What waited below confirmed their darkest suspicions. This was the original location. The room was nearly identical to the replica, same soundproof walls, same metal bed, same tripod facing the center of the space. But here, everything felt active. There were food wrappers tossed in the corner, a water bottle still half full, and a coat draped over a chair. A small, battery-powered space heater hummed in the corner, and the dust on the floor had been recently disturbed. Someone had been here, and not long ago. In the center of the mattress sat a single object, a VHS tape in a clear plastic case. No label, no date, just a piece of masking tape across the top with the words, "Are you watching?" written in black marker. The camera mounted on the tripod had a red light blinking, indicating it had been recording. When investigators checked the footage, they saw something that shook them to the core. Just 24 hours earlier, a man wearing a dark hoodie had entered the room, walked straight to the bed, placed the tape down, and looked directly into the lens. Though his face was never visible, the way he moved, calm, deliberate, and hurried, sent a clear message. He had been watching them all along. Then, without a word, he turned and left. This wasn't over. It wasn't even close. He had returned to the original basement, knowing they would come. The tape was a warning, a declaration. He was still out there, still active, still in control. The manhunt for the suspect, now known only by the name, the Collector, became one of the most intensive investigations in state history. But every lead came up empty. No fingerprints had ever been found. No surveillance footage outside the two basements. No traceable DNA. The man was a ghost. And the deeper authorities dug, the more disturbing the pattern became. Over the past decade, dozens of people had vanished within a 200-mile radius of the original basement. They were men, women, teenagers, no obvious pattern in age or background. What connected them all was the complete lack of closure. No bodies, no suspects, No final sightings. Despite media coverage, public tips, and psychological profiling, there was no progress until nearly a year later, when something chilling surfaced in another state. At a small public library in Kansas, a librarian found an unmarked VHS tape dropped into the book return slot. The library hadn't owned a VHS player in years, so the staff contacted police. What they found on the tape changed everything. The footage was identical in style to the previous tape, same basement, same light, and same silence. But this time, the person in the frame was not a civilian. It was an FBI agent, one of the lead investigators on the original case. He was seated in the center of the room, unconscious, a bruise visible above his left eye. The footage lasted only 10 minutes. He never moved. No one else appeared. The tape ended abruptly. Authorities raced to locate the agent. He was found safe in his home unharmed, confused, and with no memory of ever being taken. His last days had been routine. Nothing in his timeline matched what appeared on the tape. But the video was authentic. Experts confirmed it hadn't been altered. It was filmed recently. Somehow, the collector had either staged the footage or had access to the agent without leaving a trace. This revelation brought a terrifying new dimension to the case. The collector wasn't just recording his victims anymore, he was watching the investigators, studying them, sending messages. His reach was growing bolder, more personal. Authorities realized they were dealing with someone who wasn't just careful, he was always several steps ahead. The house on Larkspur Lane had only been the beginning, a stage built to expose a twisted obsession with control, documentation, and psychological manipulation. The basements weren't hiding crimes. They were preserving them, curated like artifacts in a museum. And now, whoever the collector was, he had turned the lens outward. No one knew where he would strike next, but one thing was certain: he wanted them all to keep watching.